Hello, all. We are going to get started in just one moment as we let folks filter in. So glad to see so many of you here for our first, um, for our first Artivist Town Hall. I'm also having the little chime. I'm quieting the chime. If you wouldn't mind, please use the chat to introduce yourself, name, pronouns, how you identify or fit within the creative sector in Massachusetts, where you're zooming in from today too. That'd be great. Let's get started. So this is a new virtual programming offering from MASSCreative, the Artivist Town Hall. And the goal here is to build some more virtual community across the Commonwealth, do some learning, right? So how are we being more aware of both advocacy opportunities? How are we strengthening our advocacy and political and policy thinking muscles? And then also a little bit about how are we intersecting or thinking about the opportunities for working with other sectors, including housing and transportation and climate justice. So you can expect a variety of sessions over once a month over the next year. And this is an experiment for us. So if you have feedback, we are really interested in hearing it. We'll drop our emails, we'll drop the email at the end, but that is sort of how we're going to proceed. We'll do this in sort of 3 blocks. So the first block, the one that I'm really excited about today, will be with our panelists, and we'll have a conversation focused around policy development and moving through policy, and advocating for pro-arts policies. Then we will do a quick little sort of government affairs update from the MASSCreative team. That'll include both updates around things that are happening right now and actions you can take. And then we'll finish off with, frankly, some open time. So if you have resources or opportunities that are local or regional or statewide that you want to make sure other folks know about, we want to know about them too. If you have a question or a challenge that's about community organizing or engaging with elected officials, you can also use that time to get some feedback and to get some technical assistance. So without further ado, I am really delighted to introduce our 2 panelists for our conversation. We have Professor Erin O'Brien from UMass Boston, and we have Joyce Linehan, who wears many hats, but is also with the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. Erin and Joyce, thank you so much for joining us today for our conversation. I'm going to just pin us so folks can see us for our combo.
I that's already, Emily.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks. We're also joined today with Team MASSCreative, Rich Lean, our Director of Organizing, and Anissa, our Development Manager. So we've got a full team here. So thanks for everyone for being here. So Erin and Joyce, thank you so much for being here today. When we talked, I said, one of the things that we're getting ready for and that we've just completed is a series of in-person community conversations to provide input from artists and creatives and cultural nonprofit leaders and creative business owners around what are the needs related to policy and related to legislation on the state level. But I also know that there's like a whole science, a literal political science around this. And then there's an art to moving policy forward and building advocacy. And so we wanted to spend some time actually sort of talking about leading up to the beginning of January when the new legislative session starts, learning a little bit more about what it all entails and how to think strategically about engaging in this work. So Erin, I am so glad to have you here. And we're just going to start as Joyce pointed out when we were talking a couple of days ago, you literally have written books on this. So we're so glad to have you here. So quite simply, what is public policy, Erin?
I've written books on it and I still don't have a great answer, which is telling. But more seriously, like this semester, I'm teaching sports and public policy. You can define public policies really big, but when I really boil it down, it's the allocation or reallocation of values and resources by government. And so that can include to regulatory behavior. We tend to think in the sort of many of us, when a bill becomes a law, that sort of stages model, but we're trying to reallocate values. Many of the artists aren't on here and to more often than not acquire resources and a seat at the table. So I think policy can also be part of it, but that's the core definition I tend to work from, because I am a political scientist, but I don't get real worried about disciplinary boundaries. So it doesn't, I'm going to define broadly when it becomes to public policy, because it's what affects our lives, our values.
And so just to dig into that for a minute, how does policy affect our communities, our cities, and our state or our Commonwealth?
I mean, when I teach intro to public policy, I sort of do, it's everywhere. And I won't, please don't be bored with this example, but I sort of ask the students, hey, how many of you drove in? And most, or about half, will answer, or, raise their hand and like, did you stop at red lights? They're like, yeah. Were you annoyed? Well, a little. Did you feel like the man was taking your power away? Did you feel like the man was being oppressive and stepping on your throat because of the red light? And they're like, of course not, right? So, that is public. You are giving up some freedom to a red light, but you're doing it because all of us, well, even though there's a Boston joke here I'm not going to make, but that if we all went without ever stopping, that it would be chaos and would be less safe, would be less likely to get what we want, which is to arrive wherever safely. So when I think about the impact of public policy, there's so many public policy goods that oftentimes aren't seen, aren't recognized. We tend to only talk about public policy when we have problems with it, or we want to see some changes. But I think it can be helpful, especially moving into the political moment we're about to go into, to name the public policies that are really positive, that are good, or at least status quo necessary to keep. Those tend to be in the shadows because they're assumptions. But to name those public policies and to work to keep them or improve upon them. So I see public policy as permeating everywhere. I define it broadly from something, anytime you're giving up some freedom to the state, but not all social control is bad. Stopping at a red light isn't problematic. Many other forms of social control, of course, are deeply problematic, but we need to figure out which public policies are which.
Got it. Thank you. Would you take us through a quick timeline, recognizing that, we're living in a little bit of the perfect timeline, but how public policy is developed, and
Sure.
what are some key moments?
Do you want to, can I pull up those slides?
Please, you should have sharing privileges.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I will say as the least artistic person alive, it is rather mortifying to share slides with a creative group who could do this much, much better. So let's focus on content more than the, and so I'm not gonna, nobody signed up for the Professor O'Brien lecture here. But these are publicly available or that will be shared. And this is the stages model of public policy. And some people, some rare unicorn creatures like Joyce can be artistic and good in the social science policy space, but most of us, self-included, only do one, okay? And so this is a stages model that I find incredibly helpful because my interest in political science and public policy comes from actually wanting to make change. I don't have intuitive interest in theory, but I have a lot of interest in policy change. And so if you go through this, and I'll do it in 3 minutes, but you'll see there's a whole bunch of other slides for those of you interested. But problem definition is the process of getting people to understand the issue the way you do. It's basically framing. Not all conditions are problems, to quote a famous political scientist. And so in the public policy process, you want to frame your issues in ways that are palatable, that ring true with any other people. They're viable, they're comprehensive. It includes these claims of authority. And that is a framing process. And I think activists, as well as creatives, and activists, I include myself there, sometimes want to make a problem definition that is pure, that is exactly what they feel. And I think that's a mistake. This is politics. Do the problem definition that's going to get the most people on your side. That's going to bring in, unlikely partners because you're trying to build a coalition. And once you've framed the problem, you've kind of, the rest of the stages aren't that hard, right? If you have it, power is excluding other problem definitions. If I was just in Montreal and they had wonderful public art everywhere, it was just like such a wonderful city. Like my friends and I were like, there's public art everywhere. And if someone frames that as it's taking from education, right? I don't think that's a frame any of us believe, but if it's perceived as zero sum of public art or education, the kids are always going to win. So you need to pick a problem definition if you want more funding for public art that doesn't allow for that zero sum and brings that sector along, right? Mm-hmm. Agenda setting is simply whether you're on government's agenda or not. And it's important as activists and artists to be thinking the systemic agenda is just the conversation. Like it's perceived as an issue. It may or may not come up. Institutional agenda is policymakers are actually like legislators, mayors are actually, the institution is talking about it and then actually deciding, right, is the decision agenda, taking a vote, if you will, or getting it through committee or a cabinet. And I think sometimes activists forget that just getting on the systemic agenda isn't enough. This isn't sexy by any stretch, but just getting a couple legislators to meet with you and talk to you means you're on the systemic agenda, but you need to keep pushing to be on that decision-making agenda, to stay there. And especially, Emily, you asked about a new legislative session. They start from jump for the most part, right? So just because you were on the systemic agenda last term, our legislature is not known for its rapid fire or anything, right? Just because you were there before means you probably need to restart, or not restart. You've already got connections. Keep reestablishing those connections. Set up new meetings. Ask who else in the legislature, who else in the city should be here? Can we get them at that meeting too? So one concrete suggestion is just because you were on the systemic agenda or the institutional agenda last time doesn't mean you are going forward. And I'm not going to go through all these in detail, but I will say to your question, another thing to think about, I think with artists with policy formulation then is like, we tend to think of policy formulation as, okay, now it's on the agenda. Let's come up with the public policies and do a cost benefit analysis. It's not the way it works. All of you, if you're on this call or on the Zoom, you are policy entrepreneurs. And it's your job as a policy entrepreneur to use, and I mean that, to use some focusing event, whatever your pet solution is, and this is out of John Kingdom, whatever your pet solution that you want in the arts, public, I'll use the Montreal example, like public art there's some terrible crime in Montreal. You know what can fix this? More public art. Education scores are going down. You know what could help this? More public art. Tourism's going down. Oh, what would help? More public art. So you have whatever we call it a floating solution, whatever focusing event comes along or whatever problem comes along, show how your solution fixes that problem. And that's the job of framing. So those are two big ones I think that we could talk about. And then we moved into, I can talk about this later, but then adoption and legitimate. I can never say that word, which might be
legitimization.
Might be interesting. Actually what gets adopted, and then also think a lot about policy implementation. Mm-hmm. That so you get something big through, you get something pretty small through. That's so much, especially I think in the art space, though you guys could correct me, is there can be distance between what the entrepreneurs, you all, the activists wanted in the legislation and got, but how bureaucrats, usually most well-intentioned, implement the public policy. So, yep. And you can have a lot of influence here because most policy implementers and street level bureaucrats aren't well-versed in your sector. And that's not to cut on them, make their job easier. Here are our goals. So just, getting a piece through the mayor's office or getting it through the legislature, I guess one of my lessons is don't stop. And you don't have to start necessarily with getting new legislation. Find out what exists, and can you shift implementation on an existing policy in ways that are advantageous for you. And so there's others, then we get into policy evaluation. So we can come back to these because I've got some other ideas about the deservedness and the way I think artists sometimes are viewed as deserving, air quotes as deserving, public policy, or most people like artists, but they don't perceive artists as a particularly politically powerful group. And because of that, the kind of public policy artists get oftentimes is an afterthought. And so we can think about other frames that beyond artists that get more carrots than sticks in public policy. So that was a very long answer, and I'm happy to dig into any of those ideas a lot more.
Thank you, Erin. And I have to say, we're later on in this call, we're going to talk a little bit about just that point about like what happens once a bill gets passed in terms of like, 25% is getting the bill passed, 75% is implementation.
Yeah. And like, what's more boring on paper than implementation? It's like federalism, and on paper, it is so boring. Students, I'm like, but once you start to think it through, so like your creative side oftentimes doesn't get played out in implementation, but you can really have disproportionate impact.
One final question for you, which is, you mentioned like Massachusetts legislature, not known for sort of like picking up where they left off at the end of a session when a new session begins. And just for everyone on this call, our legislature works in a 2-year cycle. So the newly elected state senators and state representatives will be sworn in at the beginning of January, and that will be the official start of the next legislative session. It will run from January 1 of 2025 through December 31st of 2026. That means that all bills that are filed have 2 years to make it through the finish line. The other thing that happens is in those 2 years, 2 annual state spending budgets will be passed, because we work on a year-to-year budgeting system. So
and they'll be passed late.
No, whatever do you mean, Erin? They're always passed on time. But so I wanted to ask you, Erin, like one of the things that I think we often see is that bills get stuck.
Yep.
Or bills get filed and we don't hear about them, and then all of a sudden they show back up on the radar again. Can you talk a little bit about like do you ever think about like opportunity windows for policy or for legislation?
Definitely.
Like how to take advantage of that?
I'll say 2 things about the state legislature, since I took a swipe at them to start. One of the good things about Massachusetts is that we're, depending on who you talk to, we're between first and third of the 50 states in terms of legislative professionalism. And that means like they're staffers, they work a full time, right? They have staffers, like I said, they have committees, they meet regularly, and they get paid enough where this can be their full-time job. And what that means is like there are really smart people that are there that have the time to work on forwarding public policy. So that's a total plus of our legislature. It is also notoriously slow and non-transparent, or not very transparent. But part of the reason is because good legislation takes a while to get done. Now, Emily, you asked a different question slightly. Like, where does it get stuck? The vast majority, the 6 stages I showed you, 3% of bills get through. A norm, whether it's federal, local, or state policy, especially federal and state policy, the vast majority of issues that get on the agenda, even the decision-making agenda, things like budget, like you said, Emily, have to be done, do not become public policy. So the norm is attrition. The norm is fall off. And I think that can be helpful going in when you're thinking about getting X or Y legislation through. Know that the odds are stacked against you, not because you're you, just because that's the way legislation works. But it is squeaky wheel, gets more attention. And so I think a lot of us don't particularly like talking to legislators. You're not like, oh, great, I can't wait to go with the staffer. I mean, I'm nerdy enough, I like it, but I also recognize That's who I am. And you just have to get over that because they've got 1,000 things incoming. And if you're not perpetually making calls, where does this stand? Where does this stand? And if you're not building a problem definition that makes them think, this is going to appeal to a lot of my constituents. This isn't a niche thing to just help X organization out. If your problem definition is broad enough, this will help kids. This will help, the elderly, just whatever groups you can make a part of your coalition to keep them contacting. Because, the single best predictor of legislative, individual members of Congress or the legislators' behavior is electoral self-interest. And in Massachusetts, most of the time, if you run, you're going to win again. So you want to make them beholden to you. And
Great.
so to your question, at each stage, the norm is for legislation to fall out. So what do you do with that? You have a floating solution. You're a policy entrepreneur. You're not waiting for them to call you. You're calling them. You see an event and you make it advantageous towards you. And that can feel like slimy and gross. Like I used an example of, some terrible crime occurs and you're like, public art would make it so that more people were continually in that area. It has people feel safer. There's more foot traffic and that kind of thing. Well, my personal view is as long as you get the policy, like attach it to that. And so I think you have to be ready, creative, and you have to be flexible. This is not the time for purity in your pitch. You want the legislation to be as advantageous as possible to you, because no one's going to slap you on the back for the purity of your pitch that never produces an outcome.
Got it. Thanks, Erin. Thanks, Erin. I'm going to turn it over now to Joyce to talk a little bit. So Joyce, before you joined Mass College of Art and Design, you were Mayor Walsh's Director of Policy, and you are a longtime advocate and community organizer and political strategist. So we are so glad to have you on this call to talk about the art of policy movement, of development. So we just heard from Erin a little bit about how the system works. And thank you, Erin, for some really clear, concrete ways to think about that. Why should, Joyce, why should we engage in policy development and advocacy for legislation or for government programs?
I wonder if the question is more how should, the why is, of course you should. I don't know, what do you want me to say? There's no, do you want anything to get done? Do you want the arts to be at the table? Then absolutely you have to engage. But I think that Erin shared a lot of super powerful information, and there are a few pieces of it that I would pick out and maybe shine a little bit. So in that great circular slide that she had about how policy gets made, I forget what the word was that she used, but there's basically how you decide what the policy is going to be. And she touched on this a little bit, but the really important piece of that is consensus building, right? Whether it be outside the building with voters, with community activists, whatever it is, inside the building that you're working in, you need allies in every corner. You need to understand that the arts is a sector that I think tends to work in silos. That's gotten better over the past 10 years or so, where I think organizations like MASSCreative came along and said, look, we need to be part of this larger community in order to make our way for our community. That's all great. So consensus building is really important. So for instance, if I'm in City Hall, right, and I'm the chief of policy and planning, right, but I'm also an arts person. That's where I come from, right? And I'm looking around this table of 18 to 20 people. I'm going, all right, who are my allies here? So I got the chief of economic development, who I know plays drums and he loves music, and I'm gonna bring him along. And I've got the chief of arts and culture, right, who is the one who ostensibly is supposed to be carrying this water, and the one in Boston who we have right now has done a really great job at that, but she can't do it alone. So you have to have these other allies that understand how arts and culture interacts with economic development, which is an argument that I'm kind of tired of, but I understand that it works with a lot of state legislators, works with public health, which is an argument I'm really interested in, which Erin was kind of pointing at, public health, public safety, even zoning and other kind of regulatory things. Like, you have to understand how these things work together, and you have to build consensus. You look around the building, or what I did was I look around the building and I found all the secret artists that were kind of hidden in all the corners of the building, who could kind of, people who worked at the then Boston Planning and Development Agency, I don't know what it's called now, but they, people who worked there, incredibly important, because they had this institutional memory about agreements that had been made in the past that maybe weren't being adhered to. They talk to developers all the time, which is a good source of, in a system like ours, a good source of potential revenue, right? That's where a lot of the money was being made. Things are a little different right now. But you look for those people. You look for the guy in water and sewer who thinks that the sewer covers on the streets should be beautiful, right? Like, I mean, there's lots of great nooks and crannies in a building like that you want to be aware of, so that you can, every time you're at any table where any conversation is going on, you're able to raise your hand and say, what about the arts? This is what the arts can do in this context. So you want to make sure that those people are there. When you're dealing with the state legislature, very different body, right, than a municipality. And I would argue that although Boston's big, other cities, other municipalities have the same kind of general structure, and the same stuff will work. Legislature is really different. And if you're trying to move a piece of state legislation, first of all, you're naming your problem, you're suggesting your solution, you're building consensus, you're really thinking long and hard about what the opposition is going to say, so that you're ready for that. You are thinking about unintended consequences, so you can kind of front load the thing, so that it's not something that's going to be, for instance, and Erin sort of hinted at this, unimplementable, if that's a word. But I've seen lots of legislation that just wasn't ever going to be implemented because it frankly couldn't be. It had legal problems, it had like whatever it was. You want to make sure that none of that is there. And then, and this is going to sound really craven, I'm sorry, I don't work for well, I actually do work for the state now, so but you have to make sure that you are handing it to somebody in that building who actually has the juice to carry it. Because if you are handing that bill off to a state rep and a state senator who's known to be a thorn in the side of the leadership structure and Erin's nodding her head like, yeah. I mean, if you hand it to those folks, it's not going anywhere. And it's not going anywhere not because it's not a good piece of legislation, but it's not going anywhere because government, the problem with government is politics. So just make sure that you have a path that actually will make it through the leadership. And we talked about this a little bit too. I would tell you that the session, although on the calendar it's 2 years long, it's really 18 months long. It really has to get wrapped up by the end of the fiscal year of that second year, so by July 31st. Otherwise you get into like informal sessions and nothing's going to move in those places. I think if you're a watcher of these things, you know that what happens is like on July, I don't know, 15th, they suddenly say, oh my God, we have to pass some bills. And then they start trying to like put things together. You see things like economic development bond bills. You see all kinds of sort of omnibus kind of legislation, if you will. And to the degree that you're ready to stick yourself into those things, that can be, and I think you guys have done, MASSCreative, you guys have done a good job of knowing when that stuff is happening and where you might have an opening. That will be really important too. It's also important to understand like the difference between the feds, this sounds simple, but the feds, the state and municipalities, and what they each have purview over, I don't know if everyone on this call knows about all that stuff, but it's really important to know that, so you're not say wasting the time of the state legislator by asking if they can help you with the zoning issue, right? That's clearly a municipal issue. So just kind of having certainly don't have to know it all, but having a basic understanding of how municipalities work with state government here and how all of it works with the feds. And I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone on this call, we're heading into some pretty dark times. It's probably time to sort of recalibrate a little bit and try to figure out what we can do to sort of stave off some of what's about to come. We certainly have a barrier around us, but I wouldn't call it a wall. So while things might happen a little bit more slowly here, it's going to be just dark times, that's all. So time to kind of figure out where your people are, reconnect with them, know what's going on, rally resources so that we're able to protect the people who are going to need protecting as some of this stuff happens.
Thanks, Joyce, for lifting that up. And I think one of the things that we're very cognizant of is that while we may be artists, we may be creative business owners or cultural nonprofit leaders or workers, we are also humans who have families and are part of communities, and have folks in our networks that will be really will be harmed by potential federal policy. And so that we as a community need to step up, not just to support pro-arts policies, but think about what are the policies and what are the moments where we can really join in solidarity. And that's the work that we at MASSCreative are really dedicated to helping identify those points. And if anyone on this call has opportunities or wants to direct us to lift up any of that work, please let us know. We endeavor to be a hub to share out those messages and that work. Joyce, can we talk for just a second? And Erin, I'd love to hear your perspective too, right, as a political scientist. But I think that we sometimes get caught in the trap of we're just going to use like the battering ram as advocates in an external field, right? Like we're just going to march up to the State House and demand the things that we need. And I guess this is a very biased question. I would hazard you get to do that maybe once or twice in your career, maybe. But can you talk a little bit about, again, Joyce, from your perspectives of both working in the Walsh administration and then also working really closely with the Healey Driscoll team during the campaign and still now, what are other levers that folks outside the building, whether it's City Hall or the State House, should think about using when trying to move policy forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, you got to be part of the community and not just in the little section of it that you work in, right? So in my experience going to, more like neighborhood association meetings and community meetings about a range of topics than I care to really think about. Like the artists, people who are kind of creative in nature are the first people to raise their hands when somebody asks for volunteers, right? But it's really important that say you're a musician and you want to start like a live music night at a small business in I don't know, on Dorchester Avenue, right? It's going to be, it would behoove you to know the people in the community so that when stuff starts to happen and someone starts to complain about, people leaving a place at 1 a.m. and not being respectful or the thing being too loud or whatever it is, that there's that it's not this unknown entity that's doing this, that it's actually like a member of the community that is producing whatever it is that's being produced. Like, don't allow them to be afraid of you because why would they be afraid of you? They know you and you're awesome, right? So just be a part of that community. Work with others who are working on issues that are sort of politically aligned with the things that you're working on. So, know your local affordable housing activists, know your small business owners, right? They can be really great allies and help you move things. Collaboration is really, like, it's an overused word, but it's also a great word. I mean, it really just, if you're building a team, if you're building a group of people who are working together to try to get something done, you're much more likely to be able to do it than you are if you're working on your own. And I would argue that you have to also look outside of the arts community while you're doing it. We have a tendency to be super insular, and that doesn't serve us all that well. So make sure that you are very much a part of your community.
Got it. Erin, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would concur with everything my friend said. And I would also say that it's a great question, actually. I think about it a lot. Any organization or individual in the arts or otherwise, it just plays out differently, perhaps in the arts than a different sector, should have insider and outsider strategies, right? And those insider strategies, and I don't mean insider in like the dirty way. I mean insider in like you actually have built some relationships with someone, and I saw somebody was in Worcester or out in Western Mass. You've got some connections with individuals in the mayor's office, your state legislators, whomever it is, right? You've got those relationships and you've got collaboration, like Joyce said, other groups say, we want to work on this. Who do you know? Insider strategies, like listen, everybody likes to have their ego stroked a little bit. You go, hey, we really need help on this, and here's our idea, and here's how it will benefit you, right?
Mhm.
An outsider, many of us in political science, I think there's a similarity between activists in public policy and politics and activists. There's a lot of overlap there. Sort of have a romantic view of, but the protest is cooler, but the protest is more fun. And it can be, I'm not gonna lie, right? But think you're trying to advance whatever your organization or your personal goal is. If it calls for protest, protest the hell out of it. If it calls for insider meetings, then do that. And I think a good decision-making rule there, as we call it, like it's all these terms, but expanding the scope of the bias, which the idea is when you're protesting, it's usually because you're not at the same power level, right? That you're not meeting with those people. They're not taking you seriously. They are actively making your lives worse. They're doing public policies that are actively making your lives worse. So protest, you're weaker than them. And a protest expands the scope of the bias. You know, when a fight breaks out, watch the crowd, because the crowd determines the outcome. So a protest it's more unstable now. It doesn't mean you're going to win, but more people are paying attention.
Right.
And if that's the place you're at, then use it. But if you've got these good relationships and you've been able to work with them before, then why do you need to be in the street when being in the office would get your goal? So for me, I think everybody should have both in their activist repertoire. And it's not dirty to do the meetings. It's not dirty to do those things. Sometimes expanding the scope of the bias is worse for you. Because I think at the federal level right now, if we're going to do, a reading project where artists come into the library and read books, reading, but they might have crazy ideas, like I'm obviously being a bit facetious, but not really. More attention to that doesn't help you. You just want to be not on the down low completely, but you just want to meet with your people, get your funding, and be able to do it. Why bring in actors who are going to cause you trouble? And when you're protesting, keep in mind that a lot of individuals love your protests because it confirms their own biases. It confirms the idea of, these are real air quotes. These people don't work. These people, they had the luxury of doing this at 4 o'clock on a Friday when I'm at work. And we know from the literature that, part of the individuals who have voted for Trump or stayed with Trump are part of that MAGA view government as a problem, view government workers as unfairly getting benefits they don't, and are deeply angry about the way activists break norms. And they see it as unfair. Now we can all go through maybe the internal inconsistencies and all that, and that's fine. But that's what you're dealing with. So I'm not saying don't protest. I'm definitely saying protest, but protest when you need to protest. I work on a college campus, and there's a core group of people that I swear to you would protest. Grilled cheese in the, whatever, rather than just talk to the cook and be like, hey, could we have another sandwich? And then they wonder why when dealing with the administration, it's always adversarial. I'm like, well, because they don't like you and you've disparaged them publicly in the newspaper. And, people, that hurts. Right. Nobody wants to be the subject of, it might be a great, poster, but, some terrible drawing of you and things like that. So my point is, to summarize, have the insider and outsider as a part of your repertoire of action and pull from it when you need it, and know when to use which. Give a kid a hammer. They always want a hammer. Don't do that with insider strategies all the time, but also don't do it with outsider strategies all the time.
And just to opine for a second, taking off my moderator hat. There is also I think there's like an external tool we don't use nearly enough, which is praise, right? Which is like the hero opportunity. We can be critical. but we can
And then
also
talk about
sort of-
them with your best friends later.
Yeah, but like we can also, like we can say like this decision you made or this proclamation you talked about, like is on the road or the path that we are supportive of. Thank you for that. Okay, we have already gone longer than I've allotted, and I'm so sorry because I love this conversation, but I do want to open it up to questions from the group. So I'm gonna unpin us. And I'm hoping Rich Lean, if we can start with, let me see, how do I, okay. I'm sure there are questions in the chat, but if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask the question live and in color, that would be awesome too. Okay, I'm seeing folks have put some really important things into the chat around action items, but anyone have any questions?
I would just like to offer that, I'm not saying I ever did this, but sometimes the insider will turn to the outsiders and say, okay, this is what you should do now. And that's strategy. That's what that is.
Yes, and that only happens. Thank you, Joyce, for pointing that out. And without that is something that MASSCreative has really worked hard to do, and that only happens because we have built, or Joyce, someone inside the building has a trusted relationship with external partners, right? That one can say like, hey, this is about to happen. Do you want to mention that? But there's a real high level of trust that doesn't happen just because you walk by somebody's office and say, and drop a leaflet once. It's repeated engagement, relationship building. Thank you, Joyce, for mentioning something that never happens. Okay. All right. Well, in lieu of questions, I want to thank our panelists. Let's give them virtual claps rounds. Erin and Joyce, you are amazing. Oh, Ronald, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. This is very edifying, the discussion. I need to go back to school, to college, to absorb all of it. But I wanted to inquire, what is the correlation between policy and infrastructure that brings impactful results? Because in a cross-section of my life and career, I see that as the biggest weakness, especially here in Massachusetts. The cross-section between policy and noble ideas and infrastructure to implement what is requested.
Great. Thanks. Thank you, Ronald. So let's talk about that, right? Implementation. You can have an amazing bill get passed, but if it doesn't get implemented correctly, it can go real haywire. Joyce and Erin, are there examples that you can sort of point to in Massachusetts of like, wow, here's a really great model to think about in terms of implementation, or one that you're like, here's a cautionary tale?
Yeah, I'm a glass half empty kind of person these days. But I think in my experience at City Hall, Airbnb was a really good example of the regulation of Airbnb, super thorny policy issue that had so many tentacles and had so much difficulty with implementation that also involved some serious budget impacts. So a lot of times the policy that's being built will involve some expenditures that aren't necessarily accounted for in that year's budget, and that can be really, really problematic. I think that, I want to talk for a second about ballot questions, which in my opinion, but they really are, it's a problem that happens when the legislature isn't listening to the electorate. So the electorate gets mad and they go out and they basically write a bill that may or may not have the expertise of, I get it. It's looked at by the AG to see if it's actually, if the thing it's trying to achieve is legal. So it has that going for it, but it largely will craft a bill that doesn't have any input from the people on the ground who actually have have to make sure that it happens if it gets passed. So I think we're seeing a little bit of that now with some of the ballot measures that just passed, but that is strictly the legislature not listening to people who are trying to address a very real problem, and then therefore getting this layer of, of stuff that maybe won't solve the problem, or certainly won't do it in a clean and effective way, foisted upon them.
Got it. Thanks, Joyce. Thanks.
I think those are great examples. I think of issues 1, 4, and 5, or just poorly written, right? But Ronald, you do not need to go back to school because you have the literature without having read it, because what you've named is a real issue, is a real problem but it's a norm. It's not just Massachusetts. I love you said noble ideas, the noble ideas of some public policy formulation. But so the rub is we tend to write legislation broadly without a lot of specificity. And that's strategic and smart, because the more details, there's more to dislike. Right? So if you write it broadly and don't have a ton of specifics in there, it's easier to keep your coalition together. Actors are much less likely to see it as, a problem that they, like Title IX was written pretty broadly, and they never even considered sports. I'm teaching sports and politics right now, so like that's at the top of my head. But so that is a norm in public policy, and then when it gets to implementation, the bureaucrats, and that is not a 4-letter word to me in any stretch. Those bureaucrats are trying to implement something that doesn't have real specificity. And so you used it between noble ideas and infrastructure. I would try to view it, and this might sound a little Pollyanna, I would try to view it as an opportunity. Like, you obviously know what kind of infrastructure or what kind of specificity, same idea, different language. You know what you want there. So start focusing your energies on that implementation to give best practices on implementation or infrastructure, because a lot of times, these bureaucrats may or may not have any experience in the arts. So you can be helpful to them. And so give your knowledge, and here are some best practices. They did it this way in Minnesota, or whatever there. So you're right in naming that issue. It is a norm. It's not unique to United States. It's not unique to Massachusetts. And I would just say, you've named it. Now get in on the implementation side. Focus your energies there.
Okay, thank you. Well, Joyce and Erin, thank you so much. In the chat, you will see 2 items. So Massachusetts College of Art and Design will be holding their Common Good Awards, their 2nd annual Common Good Awards, which are fantastic. That'll be on December 7th. At noon. If you are able to, if you are in the neighborhood or you're able to trek into Boston, it's a great event and we encourage you to come. And Erin has written several books, but her most recent one is More Than Blue, More Than Yankee, Complexity and Change in New England Politics. And there's a link to check that out. The Common Goods is free as well. So you can register just to RSVP so they know how many cheese cubes to buy, but it is free. Thank you both.
It's lunch, not cheese cubes. Come on. It's lunch. Free lunch.
It's an actual lunch.
Free lunch, yes.
I'm so conditioned to cheese cubes at receptions these days. Erin and Joyce have both put their emails in the chat. Thank you both so much. I'm going to move us on to do some quick updates on some things that are happening in some updates around some public policy items. And I want to flag something that's not in my slide deck, but is in the chat. So there's been some large talk around a piece of legislation that the House, and this is in Congress, tried to pass last week that would give the Secretary of the Treasury enormous room to make some unilateral decisions around the tax exempt status of nonprofits. This is without due process. This is particularly concerning, right? Because, nonprofits, and if we think about arts and cultural nonprofits, are often in spaces where we are in the crosshairs of the culture wars. And so there is real reason to be concerned that many nonprofits who are doing good work could possibly be targeted with the loss of their tax exempt status. I want to flag that last week when the vote was taken, all but one member of our members of Congress in Massachusetts voted nay The only one was Congressman Keating, who abstained. He did not vote. So if your member of Congress is not Representative Keating, a great opportunity to send them a note to say, thank you so much for voting no. The vote is supposed to happen later today, so you can encourage them to continue to vote no. If you happen to be a constituent of Congressman Keating, you may want to write into his office and say, I encourage you to vote no. It is likely that it will pass anyways because the GOP has a majority, but it is unlikely to pass through the Senate right now. So just like in terms of context, I wanted to like give a little bit of an update around that. So, okay, really quickly, some things happened on the state level in Massachusetts that's kind of exciting, which is the Mass Leads Act passed. And what does that mean? So this is the Economic Development Bond Bill, which started last spring, that I am just going through. Great. And we just passed it right away. Okay, so the Governor Healey Driscoll administration filed it. That is part of the regular work. Every other year, they file an economic development bond bill. Erin and Joyce alluded to this, which is, around July 15th, you see a bunch of big bills start to move. This is one of those big bills, and all sorts of policy gets dropped into those big bills. One piece of legislation that many of you worked in coalition with MASSCreative, Mass Inc., Mass Cultural Council, and Metropolitan Area Planning Council on was the Downtown Vitality Act, which would take a small portion of sales tax collected from online purchases and create a grant fund to support cultural districts, Main Street associations, and business improvement districts. Well, a version of that was included in the final version of the Mass Leads Act. And what it will do is there will be a fund of $9.5 million to do some of that granting. The other things that were included was a $7 million live theater tax credit that is eligible for regional theaters, off-Broadway tours, off-Broadway tryouts, off-Broadway tryouts, and then national tour launches that come from Massachusetts. And then another piece was $50 million was reauthorized for the Cultural Facilities Fund, which is good news, right? We know that's a very popular program that has done a lot of good in helping to outfit our cultural spaces. And finally, they included some language that has no money attached, but would require more transparency in terms of ticketing. So you have to actually say what the ticket price is for your event when we're talking about like concerts and such and live events. And you have to be really clear about the fees. And it also is supposed to prevent bots from buying up tickets, right? So it's the Taylor Swift ripple effect continues. This is a great example of the 25-75%, because a bond bill is not guaranteed money like our state budget. So in order for this money and these programs to actually move forward, the state has to raise the money through the sale of bonds, and the Secretary of Administration and Finance in the Healey Driscoll administration has to actually say, yes, we're going to do this. So there is going to be continued advocacy necessary that we will be engaging in, and hope many of you will engage in as well. Why is that going backwards? Okay. The other thing I wanted to flag is that we just completed all of our in-person creative conversations. This was a series of conversations we had in partnership with folks like, I'm seeing Bobby from the Record Co., Artists for Humanity, the Springfield Creative City Coalition, the Creative City Collaborative, the New Bedford Cultural Development, and the Fall River Arts and Cultural Coalition all worked in partnership with us to hold these meetings to hear directly from you all about what policies feel like are necessary right now, and what should be the direction of our legislative agenda for the next legislative session. There is an online survey that is now open. If you did not have a chance to attend one of these in-person or we held a couple of Zoom meetings too, please do the online survey. Hopefully that's going to drop in our chat in a moment or two. And the other thing I would say is if you did attend and you had hoped that 3 of your friends would join one of those meetings and they couldn't, send them the survey. It is literally going to ask the exact same questions that were asked during the conversations. But will help us we'll get more feedback and more data as we move forward. Okay, so finally, oh my gosh. Let's just be patient. Finally, 2 other things I want to just mention is that Creative Advocacy Week will be April 28th through May 2nd with a State House Day on April 30th. This is a week of advocacy and action and community building to support a stronger arts and cultural community here in Massachusetts. We are working on the details, but I want to make sure you all put that in your date books now. And there will be a day at the State House like we did last year on April 30th, which is Wednesday. Fun fact, that is probably, if we look into our crystal balls, the week that the House will be debating their version of the budget. So it's a great time for us to be in the building to talk about the value and importance of arts and culture. The other thing I want to flag is that our next Artivist Town Hall will be December 13th, and it will feature a conversation with folks from the Health Connector around how to enroll and the open enrollment period to get health insurance in Massachusetts if you need it. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides and use the remaining time we have to see if folks have questions, have items they want to discuss or lift up. I'm going to look quickly through the chat. Okay. I am not seeing any questions. I am seeing some really great advice and some links. A great pop-up event is happening on the City of Boston Civic Pavilion. Okay. Just scrolling back up. I'm seeing a note around the citizens legislative seminars from Mass was really helpful and went through how things work, and some of the senators met to explain what they look for to hear, what they look to hear when choosing what to support. And then there's the Arts Factor report that was put together by Arts Boston, which is focused on the greater Boston region, but has some really great stats that's, even though they're a little old now, still really hold water. Okay. Right. Okay. We have, once again, thank you to our guest speakers, Erin and Joyce. Thank you, all of you, for joining us in community and being here with us together. This is, we will get better at this. We'll do better about managing our time to hold a little bit more space for more conversation, but we want this to be a dialogue, not a monologue. So having you all here is so great. And we look forward to our next conversation in December. Have great days, y'all.